Welcome to African Roots, brought to you by DW. In this podcast series, we discover how individuals from across Africa shaped the continent. I'm Cai Nebe.
And I'm Laila Johnson-Salami.
Laila, I've been really looking forward to this one for quite a while.
Me too, because this time around, Cai, I have got a heavyweight lined up. One man who is, I would say, synonymous with Pan Africanism, also ending colonialism, and who was even portrayed in Netflix's The Crown.
I think we both understand the significance of this moment.
Yes.
I probably gave it away. Can you guess?
They're dancing.
Is the leader from West Africa?
He sure is.
And does his country have a black star on its flag?
Yep.
Then it can only be the one and only Kwame Nkrumah. But Laila, I'd like to point something out here. For a man who led Ghana to independence, what I do know about him, and this is kind of controversial, I think, is that he died in exile outside of Ghana in Guinea. So I really want to know what the backstory is here.
Well, yes, Cai, that is true, and we will get there. But first, let's start perhaps in the most fitting place, Ghana's capital, Accra. We're near the Atlantic beach in a truly grand memorial park with fountains and, of course, a big statue of the man himself, kind of at odds with this bustling, loud city. There's a statue of a striding Nkrumah, and it was here that he declared Ghana's independence from Britain in 1957.
And what was the lead up to this?
Well, I could tell you, Nkrumah was born in 1909, that he became a teacher and taught at various schools in Ghana. Or I could tell you that, in the 1930s, he stowed away on a boat to study in the United States.
What? Really? He was a stowaway?
Why, yes. Even back then, people were desperate, Cai, for higher education. I mean, I could also tell you that he made it over to Britain, where he met many other future leaders of African states, or that he returned to Ghana to agitate for independence. But Cai, I'd really like to start his story right here in Accra, at the site where he declared Ghanaian independence.
Forward then, to independence. To independence now.
And I'd like to start here because, it pretty much marks the high point of his political career. Of course, he went on to become Ghana's first president in 1960, but this wasn't enough for Nkrumah.
Kwame Nkrumah was special or unique in the sense that he did not think only Ghana. His vision cut across Africa.
That's Dr. Wilhelmina Donkor, historian at Ghana's Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology.
And that was why at independence in 1957, he made that famous statement that the independence of Ghana is not complete unless it is linked up with the total liberation of the whole continent.
So the big deal about Nkrumah was not actually that he was Ghana's first black leader then.
Well, no, not per se, Cai. This Pan-African vision makes Kwame Nkrumah a revered figure across and even beyond the continent. He thought that by uniting the increasing number of independent African countries into a political bloc, that Africa as a whole would be more powerful, which at the time was revolutionary and a nice thought because many of the newly independent states then had fought one common enemy, the colonial master.
So, but what did Ghanaians think of this at the time?
This is where things do become more difficult for Nkrumah. See, Ghana was actually a very prosperous British colony, the model colony, in fact, we can say. But Nkrumah, who had just spent years fighting for independence, didn't really want to appease Western former colonial powers,
Yeah.
He believed that Ghana could only truly be free if it was economically independent. So he sought help from Eastern Bloc countries, which did annoy the West, and he tried to implement state-controlled elements into the economy. And, Cai, while his first attempts at rapidly industrializing Ghana's economy did seem promising, the experiments in building factories were either unprofitable or failures. There was unrest in Ghana, and he had an increasingly authoritarian streak.
Oh, that's a bit of a plot twist. So he went from kind of a liberation hero to essentially a dictator.
Yep, plot twist indeed. I mean, he even had the constitution changed to make him president for life in 1964. Things came to a head when Nkrumah was toppled, and that was in a military coup that took place in 1966. And that was also while he was on a state visit to North Vietnam. Now, at this stage, Ghana's economy was in tatters.
Before Nkrumah left, what was happening? We were queuing at the sports stadium to get rations of sugar. Is that not true?
That's the voice of Professor Michael Cai, a political historian and also Ghanaian politician.
It's true. The factories were not working because we started to run before we could walk. And it's important for people not just to talk about vision. I was then, in 1964, I was a student in Lagos. About a quarter of students, or at least 20% of students, had come from all African countries to come and chop scholarship in Ghana. Why? You see, you cannot help beyond yourself. Nkrumah became very popular. Ghana was rich. To dissipate resources in that manner was most unfortunate.
Laila, I'm just struggling to connect the dots here. What went so wrong for Kwame Nkrumah? Because this is not even 10 years after Ghana became an independent country.
True, Kai. But, keep in mind as well that in the newly independent Ghana, Nkrumah was trying something different. He wasn't just fighting colonialism in Africa, but also capitalism. Nkrumah is someone who believed in a particular sort of African socialism, which united social justice and I could also say African traditions, at the same time. And Nkrumah's approach to politics in Ghana often did contradict the socialism that he did write about.
Nkrumah was a very interesting leader in the sense that, on one hand, he seemed to have given a lot of rhetoric about socialism and so on. But in reality, not all his policies were necessarily socialist in orientation. For me, that makes him very interesting.
Right, Laila. I agree. This does make Kwame Nkrumah a very interesting leader and also a fascinating case study. But the thing I don't quite get yet is, if we are accepting that he was such a flawed leader, with his refusal to hand over power and his authoritarian streak, why then is he so revered across the continent as kind of the father of a free Africa, as it were?
Good question, Kai. He wasn't for quite some time. That memorial park that we visited earlier, that was only built almost 30 years after he left Ghana. In fact, Nkrumah never returned to Ghana after going into exile. But to many across the continent, Kwame Nkrumah is mostly remembered for championing that idea of an African political union.
This mid-20th century is Africa's. This decade is the decade of African independence. Forward then to independence. To independence now. Tomorrow, the United States of Africa.
So that was actually Kwame Nkrumah speaking live around the time of independence. And he's referring to something called the United States of Africa. And I'd just like to check on that. Is what we have now, which is known as the African Union, kind of what he was envisioning at that time?
Arguably so. And, Kwame Nkrumah was indeed one of the founding members. But the AU, or the Organization of African Unity, was often anything but unified. During the Cold War, countries were split into pro-Western and pro-communist camps. Some even remained more loyal to their former colonial masters.
So, in effect, not quite the United States of Africa, then?
Unfortunately, not quite, Kai.
Well, Laila, your story of Kwame Nkrumah has definitely been a roller coaster, but I think the guy that I have is also a match for the story. When we come back, we meet another former teacher, this time from East Africa, whose visionary ideas set him and his country on a new path.
Now you've got me curious.
When we are gonna see you again. DW African Roots. Find new African Roots episodes on dw.com/African Roots, Spotify, iTunes, and wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back to African Roots. I'm Cai Nebe.
And I'm Laila Johnson-Salami. Cai, before the break, you did mention that you were going to introduce me to another teacher.
Not just any teacher, Laila. I'd like you to meet Julius Nyerere, the Tanzanian statesman who would also be known as mwalimu, which literally means teacher in Kiswahili.
Was teaching like some rite of passage for leaders to go through?
Well, at times it does seem like that many of these independence leaders at one time or another did teach or that they did a similar profession. But remember that pre-independence, in many African countries, teaching was often one of the very few avenues that Africans could actually pursue, because it wasn't really in the colonialists' interests to have their subjects being educated as lawyers, as economists, and all of these things, because they had the colonies for the idea behind the colonies was that they would serve the colonial master.
So was Nyerere a contemporary of Nkrumah?
Not quite. He was a bit younger. He was born in 1922 to a local chief on the far other side of the continent in the de facto British colony of Tanganyika in East Africa. Now, compared to Nkrumah, I do get the feeling that Nyerere is somehow stumbled into a political career. He was a very bright scholar and a teacher, first at Makerere College in Uganda, before earning a scholarship to study abroad in Scotland in 1949. By the way, he was actually the first Tanganyikan ever to study at a British university. And the irony of this whole thing is that it was there, in the land of the colonists, that Nyerere's interest in politics grew. So he returned to Tanganyika in 1952, where his oratory skills, his level head, and his non-violent campaigning for independence made him pretty much an independence leader.
I'm curious, Cai. When all of this was going on, did people actually expect that the colonial empires were going to fall then? What was the general expectation?
This, to me, is always a very fascinating question. How prepared were the colonial masters to actually give up their colony? And I think the answer here is that no, the colonial masters did not expect their colonial empires to fall. In fact, when Nyerere told a United Nations trusteeship in 1955 that he thought colonialism would end in 24 years, no one actually took him seriously. And he said that in 1955. Anyway, Nyerere helped Tanganyika become an independent nation in December 1961. And at this stage, I don't think that even Nyerere himself saw himself as the face of Tanganyika or Tanzania as it would become. And here is a soundbite from him speaking at the time, which kind of points to this.
Well, I must say immediately, I'm not planning it. I think it's being planned by the people of Tanganyika themselves.
And this characteristic, I think, is what sets Nyerere apart from most other post-colonial leaders. He remained a very down-to-earth man. He avoided the trappings of power. He focused heavily on things like education. And with results, by the 1980s, illiteracy had almost been completely eradicated from Tanzania. He pursued and got unification with the island of Zanzibar, after which Tanganyika became known as Tanzania.
That's amazing. And, I'm starting to see the differences now because with Nkrumah, for example, there were images of him all over Ghana. So much so that one can say he kind of developed a personality cult.
It's interesting because, in a way, being profoundly committed to the welfare of his country and being humble was Nyerere's personality cult. This was how he saw how a leader should really behave. He had a very different idea of what leadership looked like when you compare him to Nkrumah.
He loved people. He wasn't biased. He was a man of the people. There are pictures of him holding a pickaxe, engaging in nation building with others.
That's Victoria Bash, the assistant curator at the Nyerere Museum in Dar es Salaam. One of Nyerere's nation-building strategies was to promote Kiswahili rather than English as the national language. And he also believed in forming unions with neighboring countries.
But they weren't independent yet, were they?
Exactly. Nyerere apparently offered to delay Tanganyika's independence so he could form an East African Union with Kenya and Uganda. He allowed politicians and independence fighters from other African countries like Zimbabwe, South Africa, Mozambique to set up bases in Tanzania. And it was also his army that chased out Ugandan dictator Idi Amin in 1979.
But was Tanzania prosperous after independence?
Well, like Nkrumah, Nyerere also believed in building a type of African socialism that would wean Tanzania off the East and the West. His form of collective agriculture was called Ujamaa, and it was named after the Kiswahili word for family. But to make this system work, rural people were forced to relocate into village collectives. And by the 1980s, Tanzania's agricultural production had dropped to a point where it was actually importing more food than exporting. And this was a serious drain on the economy and also caused a lot of tension in the country itself.
So, I mean, Cai, if Nyerere's policies weren't working, why wasn't he voted out?
Well, here is another trait of Nyerere's presidency, and that's that he also became increasingly intolerant of dissent, and he'd actually turned Tanzania into a one-party state. But this didn't stop Nyerere from being admired within the country. Here's Tanzanian historian Said Mohammed, who kind of sums up the feelings that people had towards him.
Nyerere was courageous. First of all, I must tell you, Nyerere was a brilliant public speaker. But his greatest fear was the formation of a political party on religious grounds. He was afraid that the Muslim community would organize themselves in the same way they did to get rid of the colonialists. And based on my research, anybody you ask about Nyerere would tell you that he is someone who you couldn't bribe. Money and wealth were not important to him. And we have seen this. It's not something we've been told. Rather, we have seen it with our own eyes.
So when exactly did Nyerere give up his leadership?
In 1985, Nyerere retired as president before passing away in 1999. And looking at his legacy today, we have to see that his policies like Ujamaa and the collective agriculture systems that he brought in to try and actually unify and wean Tanzania off foreign aid actually were catastrophic failures from an economic standpoint. But still, Nyerere maintains this aura of being a statesman and also someone of unquestionable integrity.
And, you know, I guess an interesting trait that's common to both Nyerere and also Nkrumah is that they were really trying something new, you know, in their post-colonial empires. None, nor really their peers, had public policy or administration experience, and they were taking over countries beset by underlying conflicts that were hidden under colonialism.
Right, that's one point. But for me, that's also quite interesting is that this idea and this conviction that Pan Africanism really was the way to go, unifying was the way to go. And I find this interesting because I believe that it's an ideal that must have seemed so tangible at the time, at the beginning of the decolonization process, which, but you know, as we've seen, has not really materialized later.
True, you know, and I think it's easy to look at their mistakes in hindsight and see where things went wrong. But regarding Pan-Africanism, you know, we're now 50 years on, and a truly Pan-African United States of Africa does remain elusive, especially in the way that Nyerere and Nkrumah envisioned it.
That's where we will have to leave things for today. Special thanks to our producers Thomas Schmidt, Maya Braun, and Philip Zattner. Additional research from Isaac Kalechi, James Muhando, and Hawa Bihoga. I'm Cai Nebe.
And I'm Laila Johnson-Salami.
Join us again next time. Bye for now.